you guys, to get started on this week's project, you just need to have your wear board, like last week, some sort of container with water, and your sponge, your wooden long tool, your needle tool, your metal rib, and some clay, the form that you're wanting to make. So like I mentioned, I want to make a vase myself, and I've been thinking about a form with maybe an oval base instead of a more traditional just circle round base. So starting with an oval, having a nice wide stable base that curves in with a nice shoulder, has a good little neck here that flares back out into the neck. And this is something I could spend some time altering. I could make it wavy. I could lay some clay across it to make like a grid that the flowers can be put into. But for today, I'm just gonna work with a more simple, traditional end to this project so you can see the basic skills. So we're gonna work with this form to start with. So to make a vase, like I'm thinking of it, I'm gonna start by thinking about like sketching out the base of the piece with just a slab of clay. So I've just pulled a bit of clay off of my lump here, and I'm gonna start to press it out into the oval shape that I want my bottom of my vase to be. So really, I'm just taking that, and with my thumb, I'm pressing it out against the tabletop here, just roughly sketching it into an oval shape. And I can use my finger and smooth that inside. One thing I'm leaving are these little edges, these little rolled edges. I'm doing a lot of work to press down here at the bottom, which will become the flat bottom of the piece. That'll sit nice on the floor or the table. But I'm leaving these little walls, which will be where I'll add my first coil. So, once I'm happy with my oval, and again, it can be kind of a rough shape, it doesn't have to be precise at this point. I'm gonna roll those sides up a little bit more so that they have a little more height to them and gives my coil something to lean against. So there's the base of my piece. Now that could be a circle if you're wanting to make a round vase. That could be a square-ish form. It could be a lot of different shapes to start with. But having a nice, probably 1/4 inch thick here at the bottom, top thickness here, what will actually be the bottom, and then a little fatter on the edges where we have our walls starting. That's your base. So I'm just taking another small piece of clay from my block of clay here, and to start a coil, I'm gonna just squeeze it in my hand a little bit until it begins to grow longer and starts to take that log shape. I'm not squeezing too hard in any one place. I don't want to mash that clay to where you really see fingerprints. I'm doing pretty gentle squeezes, keeping my fingers really tight together so it stays pretty even. Once I've got that squeezed out into kind of a little bit thinner of a log, I'm going to lay it on the table and, resting my hands on it, start to gently roll that out. You may have done this before in an art class or as a kid playing with Play-Doh. This is just a simple rolling out a snake of clay, a little coil of clay. Taking your fingers, you're never pressing too hard, just a very gentle, steady pressure, rolling your hands up and down. And I move them away from each other to pull that clay out into a longer coil. Sometimes you'll see a fat part growing where you haven't been pressing as hard, and it'd be thinner in other parts where you press a little bit harder. I would go back to that fat part, push down a little bit more, just enough that it starts to match my thin parts here. And I'm not gonna go over those thin parts again. I'm gonna leave them that thinness and just get this to match it. So working in the middle here where I have it a little bit fatter, I'm pulling that fatness out towards the sides. I'm not pushing down here where it's already thin. I'm just finishing it out on the ends, especially over here where it's a little bit thicker, and get that to match. So now I have a pretty even long string of coil. Something to be aware of is that if you're spending a lot of time rolling one coil out on this board, the water is going to slowly be pulled out of the clay into the board. So over time, if you spend too much time, this clay will start to dry out to where it cracks and doesn't want to fold and bend without splitting and breaking. And so that can be a problem as you're beginning to work on your piece. So to work quickly enough that this isn't drying out is kind of important. And if you feel like you're still working on a coil and it's not getting your thinness that you want, but it is starting to dry, get your fingers just a tiny bit damp from the water here. I'm not getting a lot of water because I don't want to make this too sticky, but I can run some water over the coil and reintroduce water to its outside here and even smooth out any cracks that were happening. And that will let you keep working on it for a little bit longer before you might have to wet it again and eventually have it ready to be used on your piece. So you want that coil to be nice and soft and supple where it can bend and move without splitting. So now that you have a first coil made, we're going to put it on the base we have here. So you take your coils and you're going to set them inside this lip here that we left on the base. So taking my end, I'm going to start here at the end of the pot. I'm just gently squeezing it against that little low wall that I left, just enough that it kind of sticks in place, and I make the full ring around the base. And when I meet up here, I just tear away the extra clay here and set it aside. So it's just slightly overlapping. And make sure that overlap sits nice and snug against the end here, and I can smooth that in so it becomes a one single loop in the piece. So now that I've got that coil laid in place on the inside of this low wall, I'm going to make my way around the piece, pinching those two pieces together. So the coil plus that fatness of the wall, when they get squeezed together, imagine those two pieces, they're going to actually grow in height. So you can see how that is growing from the lower, fatter two coils of clay into a thinner wall that's a little bit wider. So we don't want to be making our walls much thinner than that. Again, this is about our 1/4 inch thickness. That's kind of a good rule, is a good 1/4 inch is a safe, sturdy thickness. If you go much thinner, you're going to have trouble with it wanting to split or break. If it's much thicker, it just wastes clay that could be made into more height. So I'm going to go around this whole ring, squeezing it just like that. A very even, steady squeeze. And I can move my fingers and you can see where I squeezed. I'm going to put my next fingers, one on this high spot that was made between my two fingerprints, and the other on this fat part that hasn't been squeezed yet. So putting them on those two spots, I give another even, steady squeeze. Now there's a new high spot and the new next fat spot that hasn't been squeezed. I make it around the whole pot like that. Just a gentle, steady squeeze. So you can see that my walls are about that 1/4 inch thickness all the way around. And you can see how much height was gained by just that one coil. You can see all these fingerprints. I'm not gonna worry about these yet. Once I get a couple of coils in, then I'll work on starting to smooth these. But right now, they kind of just give me a rhythm for where I wanna put my fingers next time. So after that coil's been squeezed into place, you set your base aside again, get a little bit more clay from your clay block. We're gonna squeeze it into a good coil. Just that good, basic, thick log that'll be the beginning of a coil. And then lay it on the table and start to roll it out. So So sometimes when you are rolling a coil, you end up pushing a little too hard your first roll or two, and the coil becomes kind of flat on one side. So it's thinner here, broader and flatter here. And so instead of rolling nicely, it kind of hops and skips over the table because it's not round, it's kind of like a flat bar that's getting flopped around. If that happens, turn it to where that skinny side is on the table and the tall side is kind of upright, and push back down on it to squish it back into, right now it's gonna be more like a square as opposed to like a kind of rectangular thickness. But then if I do a really steady, even roll, I can round those corners of the square out and have actually a nice round coil again. That's a lot of times the mistake that you'll see when you're learning to roll a coil, is that you'll have pushed a little too hard and flattened it. And that's an easy way to fix that flatness. So now I have another good coil. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to set up my little base here. I'm going to start here on the end and just gently squeeze where that coil will tack into place just below the rim on the inside of my base. I'm going to make it all around the circle. I just pinch off that extra clay, lay it aside. I'm going to make sure this coil is stuck into place all the way around that rim, and then I'm going to make my way around again, pinching. So a nice steady, gentle squeeze. Things that you might see go wrong right now, if you squeeze too hard, or if you squeeze and you kind of pull your hands out, you'll start to see your shape, rather than growing in a straight upright line, it's going to start to flare and fall out. Ways to remedy that are, instead of letting your hands pull apart as you squeeze, actually pinch this hand and this hand that are squeezing, pinch them together. So push these two sets of fingers towards each other as you're making your pinching motion. And that'll help that clay that's stretching, help it just stretch up, but not out and away from itself. You want to kind of pinch it back in this direction so you keep a nice straight line, but let it grow up with that pressure of the squeeze. So kind of pinching those fingers towards each other as they give their good squeeze to keep my wall nice and straight right now. So at this point you can look at your shape, kind of go around it, and if there's any areas that you don't like or any areas that look pretty bumpy, you can give a gentle squeeze on those bumpy or high points and press them back into the wall so it's less dramatic or bumpy. You also can see on the inside, you can see these lines where each of the coils have been added. I want to go in before this wall gets too tall and smooth those lines in. Just using my thumb and going along those lines and just kind of smearing it across the layer below until it erases the line. So if you can see where it started to erase it, I'm going to do that all the way around the inside of the pot. Okay, so now I'm going to do a few more layers of this pot, just like I've shown you before, and I'll speed it up so you can kind of see the wall begin to grow. Alright, so you can see some of the height that I've gotten so far in this wall here. You can also see some of the lines of the coils as it's built up. I'm going to go back and erase these lines at the very end, but I'm not really worried about them now as I go. A few pointers as you're building and as you're getting some height in your wall. I have used no water in the building process so far. So my walls, they're very flexible. You can see how easily they move as I squeeze it, but they are fairly stiff, like they're holding their upright shape. If you have used some water in the smoothing process, or as you're working it, if it feels like it's getting pretty floppy and weak, you can let this sit for 15 to 20 minutes and your base here will begin to stiffen up, getting closer to a leather hard state like we talked about in the last lesson. And when this base is a little bit stiffer, you can go back in and add your new coils and this base will hold its form. So if its floppiness is causing you trouble, I would take your sponge and wet this very top ring pretty well, but don't wet the sides, and let it sit for 15 minutes. If you come back and it's still pretty floppy, wet this top ring again, and then let it sit for another 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes, and come back and see if it's a little bit better, a little bit stiffer, and will support your next coils better. If it's that weak, it might be a sign that you're squeezing too hard and making your walls too thin. If the walls are thin, they'll have a harder time supporting the coils that you're adding to the top. So again, it's important to give a very gentle, steady squeeze as you go around so you don't have any random thin spots or that the whole piece itself is too thin to support the weight of new coils. A few other pointers, just as you're doing the coil building and pinching motion, you want to make sure that you have your pointer fingers inside the pot, thumbs outside the pot, and they are pretty straight up and down. So I've kind of got these little crab pinchers straight up and down, and as I pinch, I just put them over the wall and squeeze my fingers and push my hands together. So that's what I do when I'm building a straight wall like this. I'm pinching and pushing these fingers together to keep that collar of my top ring the same tightness as the base, but let that clay grow up in height as I squeeze. So those are the pinching motions described again before I continue. So as you can see, I've also gone through and mostly smoothed away all of the rings and marks on the inside. I wanted to talk through that again. Especially as your wall gets taller, it's important to support the wall when you're doing that smoothing motion. So either I'm cupping this piece in my hand where these fingers are supporting the outside, and I can reach in with my finger to smooth, or I'm smoothing with my thumb on the inside, but supporting the wall with my fingers on the outside. If you are not supporting the wall, then you'll tend to push it out as you scrape and smooth that clay so that there aren't any lines. And if you're pushing that wall out, you're thinning the clay and you're changing your shape to something that maybe you weren't planning for it to be. So I'm setting my fingers where they're supporting here on the outside. And with my thumbs, I'm making sure I go around and get the rest of those lines smoothed out. Because right now, this is the last chance I have to really be able to reach my thumb all the way down here into the bottom. So I want to make sure that I've gotten that all smooth. So from here on out, I'll only have to smooth the new parts that I build. So there's my piece so far. I'm going to look at this drawing again. So we can see I've built up to about here. I'm going to start to build it in this curve. I'm going to show you how to tighten that form in and make this ring smaller and smaller. So setting this piece aside, I'm going to get another coil just like before, grabbing a plug of clay off and squeezing it into that fat, even log of clay. I'm going to start to roll it out. Keeping a steady pressure. If I get any lumps or any parts that are not a round side here, I'll work them out until this coil becomes round all the way around. Starting with my hands in the middle, I'm pulling them away towards the ends, and that helps stretch that clay out into a longer, thinner coil. If I get a high part, I work that back down so it's a nice round coil. Rolling. Looking for a coil that's between 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch. 1/4 inch and less is probably too thin. Bigger than 1/2 inch is probably too thick. So this one's closer to the 1/2 inch size. But it doesn't matter if they're all exactly the same thickness. You just want them to be even. Each coil that you make, you want it to be even with itself. So I've laid that around that inside ring, just at the rim level, maybe just slightly hovering above is fine. I want to make sure that this end overlaps evenly, and then I really push those edges together so it becomes one coil that's kind of just stuck and sitting there inside my ring. So if I want to start keep stopping at letting this wall just grow straight up, I want to start to create my curve as this wall narrows in towards the neck. I'm going to be more intentional about squishing my hands together as I pinch. So I'm pinching and pushing these hands together a little bit more dramatically than I was before. So putting these pointers on the inside, I'm actually separating my hands a little more than I've been doing. As I make that squeeze, I really pinch them in and I actually push my hands towards the middle of the clay ring here to start to guide this whole ring inward. I'm going to find that high spot right here, put my first finger there, second finger a little bit away from it, pinching and pushing those fingers together, squishing that clay in, kind of puckering it up, as well as pushing my hands inward towards the center here. So I'll go around the ring doing that. So it gets kind of a messy pucker sometimes when you're doing that, but all of that will be smoothed out after I finish this ring. So I'm not worried about that. I just want to establish a smaller ring now that I'm trying to move in towards the neck. So you can see already that I've created kind of a shoulder here, and it's curving in to make a narrower neck. So I'm going to go around just lightly squeezing any parts that are really high or bumpy parts to make sure that it's fairly even. And I'm going to take my thumb on the inside and do that smoothing job that we've been doing. So I'm going to make sure that this coil I've just added is smooth into the layer below it before I go farther. So I'm pushing my thumb kind of against the clay here on the inside, trying to seal that line off. That doesn't have to be perfect either. You just want to make sure that it is smooth enough that that clay is really sealed together. Any subtle lines will be erased with glaze later on. I can also spend some time here at the shoulder, making sure I like the way the shape is. There's some weird points here on the edge, maybe. And I'll take my thumb and just find those high points and just smooth them in, supporting the clay on the inside with my fingers. I'm just resting that hand on the inside to create kind of a support for my wall. I'll go around smoothing some of those lines in too. But mostly right now I'm just looking for any weird, high, bumpy parts on that shoulder that I've made. Smoothing those in. So you can see that kind of made a nicer round shoulder to start with. So going from here, I'm going to add a few more coils. Alright, so you can see that I've brought this curve around into a pretty narrow neck now. Turning it to a better profile, you can see how that curve kind of goes from the base here, making a pretty long curved shoulder. I'm getting to the end of the amount that I want to actually squeeze this in, and I'm about to start to flare it back out. Alright, so you can see that I've built this wall up into the neck and shoulder, getting it to where I have a smaller, narrower neck ring here. And I'm ready to begin to make my reverse flare, curling this lip back out to make the top of my vase here. So, starting with this vase that I have going on, I'm going to set it aside Get another piece of clay to make my next coil. These coils don't have to be as long as the others because my hole is getting smaller and smaller. So rolling that out, I'm gonna just place it in the same way I've been working, all the way up the side of the pot here. Making sure I just gently squeeze it against the wall to where it stays in place. Then I'm gonna make my way around the top of this pot, pinching all the way around. But this time, instead of pinching my fingers and pushing my hands together to continually narrow it, I'm just gonna give a normal pinch and let that neck start to straighten up all the way around the sides. Just a nice pinch without moving my fingers away from each other or towards each other. Just a good gentle squeeze with both fingers. So you can see how that neck has lengthened a little bit. I'll take this other half of that coil and do the next round. To pinch my way around. Just a normal pinch. And do it where you can see. Pinch that wall up. So you can see how that neck is pretty tall now. Now I'm going to begin to actually flare it out. So smoothing those coils into place before I go farther. I don't want to get farther than I can reach with my thumb before I smooth those coils. We get a little bit more clay here. So this next coil, as I pinch, I'm going to actually let my hands push that rim outward as I go so I can start to create that outward flare. Lay this coil in place. So watch as I squeeze. I'm squeezing and turning my hands outward a little bit. Squeezing and turning them outward a little bit. Just a very gentle pull out. I don't want to do too much at once, otherwise it'll make like a corner instead of a curve. I don't want to have any angles. I want to keep this nice, graceful neck that I'm working on. So you can see it's starting to get that tilt out. So we're just going to keep building it until we like the flare that we have. Alright, so now that I have finished my flare out and I've got that neck of the vase the way I like it, now I'm going to spend some more time smoothing and finishing the outside of this pot. So any area where I see fingerprints that I don't like or raised bumpy edges that I don't like, I can just start with my hand, just my thumb or my finger, and start to use it like an eraser and just wipe out any marks that you don't like. Your thumb will start to give it a nice burnished sheen. And I can work my way around the whole outside of the pot with just my finger first and get a lot done. This rim, how it's a little bit rough and wavy, you can spend some time just shaping it by squeezing up with your fingers on any low parts and bring them in line with any high parts. Or if you need to, you can trim away parts that you don't like that are too tall or rough with your needle tool. It acts like a knife. You can just carve away at some of that rim. But I'm going to spend some time shaping the rim to where I like it and smoothing any of these rings that I have inside my rim. Get them all blended in and smeared across to where there's no layers of those coils left behind. Just gonna let my thumb go around, erasing those marks. All right. And as a final touch for the rim, now that it's starting to look a little bit neater, you can take your finger and just wet it a little bit in the water and run it around the rim until you've got a nice, slightly damp rim where your finger slides across it easily. Then you can just take your fingers and run them over the rim at all angles, supporting it where it's thin and weak. But just run your finger over and erase any jagged parts or split and rough parts or parts you don't like. Make them nice and smooth and blend that all in together to make a really nice finished looking rim to your pot. Always supporting that nice flare of the rim, because if I'm just pushing without supporting, I'm going to start to push this rim out and flop it over where I won't like it. I want to keep my nice curve here. So I'm also going to work my way up the curve with my thumb, starting to just blend in those last lines that I left behind. Once you do an initial wipe down with your fingers, then we're going to use this metal rib here. You can take it and just go over the whole surface of your vase or vessel that you've made, and it'll give a really nice finished, burnished surface for it. So if you feel like as you scrape this tool across the surface, using that rounded side, if you feel like it's pushing in too much with your pressure, then let your pot sit out for 15 to 20 minutes and stiffen up a little bit. You want it to still be wet enough that it'll smear as you drag this tool across the surface, but you can let it get stiffer to where it kind of pushes back and you have some resistance so you're not collapsing your walls. So mine is a good stiffness for right now, so I can go ahead and keep working on mine. I can use that curved edge to fit nicely into my curve of my neck here and really smooth it well. Now I'll just keep working on the smoothing until I'm really happy with the surface. Just remember that as you finish your piece, always make sure you're signing the bottom with your first and last name, so as we fire things back at the studio, we'll be able to make sure everything comes home to the right places. Thanks so much for doing this project with me. I'm excited to talk about it with you guys on Thursday.